If you're not the executive director, the coffee is only $250. This talk today is about the hidden costs of proprietary software. Now, I've been in the computer industry for 40 years. I've been a programmer, systems administrator, I've been a marketing manager, educator, and I tell people that most importantly, I've been both a customer and a vendor of software. So I've been on both sides of this. I've been the person who's been waiting for that bug patch or that enhancement so that I can do my job better, and I've been the person who's been trying to produce that bug fix or that enhancement so that my customers can do the job better. And most importantly, and this confuses a lot of people when we talk about free software, I am not a communist, I am not a socialist, I am a capitalist. When I was in college, I was a Democrat, but the first time I paid my paycheck and saw the taxes coming out of it, I became an instant Republican. I am a fiscally conservative, socially liberal person, and if we can ever find somebody like that to go to the legislature, that'd be great. Now, my lawyers tell me that I have to keep reminding people that Linux is a trademark of Linus Torvalds. If you'd like to use the term Linux in the name of your products, it's perfectly okay. If you want to have a Linux brand of clothes or a Linux brand of car or a Linux brand of food, that's perfectly all right. But we ask that you help us protect it by registering that at the Linux Foundation. And Unix is a trademark of Xopen in several countries. It's used as a standard so that people can implement a Unix-like operating system without having to pay any royalties to SCO. Okay, now I'd like to just briefly remind people that when we say the word free software, we're not really talking about money. We're talking about the 4 freedoms that come with free software. The freedom to look at the source code, the freedom to change the source code, the freedom to give that source code to anybody who needs it, and most importantly, the freedom to use that software for any purpose whatsoever. Now, in the early days of free software, there was a lot of people that said, I don't want my software used by the military, or I don't want to use my software used by the police, or I don't want to, and those people eventually left the free software movement because they had this problem. But a lot of the people who I deeply respect, people like Alan Cox and Linus Torvalds and various others, said, look, if you start limiting the software based on the potential use of damages, then eventually nobody will be able to use any software for anything. And just like a hammer can be used to build a house or a hammer can be used to kill somebody, it isn't the tool that's the problem, it's what's happening behind it. But in all the years that I've known Richard Stallman, and believe me, I've known him a very long time, he has never once said that you shouldn't be able to make money writing free software. It's just that after the software is written, it should be free. Free isn't freedom. Now, yesterday I talked a little bit about the early days of when I was in computers, and that's actually a picture of the first computer I ever used. That's an IBM 1130. All the people with gray hair can now go, ooh, ah. And it had all 4K words of memory to it. It ran one program at a time, and that's why those lights up there were useful, because when you ran only one program at a time, you could actually see what the program was doing with the lights. It actually had a set of sense switches. No, I'm not getting that. Sense switches up there in the console. By flipping those switches, you could make the program do different things. You could sense the positions of the switches. If you tried to do it on a modern day computer system, you had to flip the switches so fast, it wouldn't work. But that was a great little machine. Now, back in those days, there was very, very, very little what you might call commercial software per se. That's stuff that you would go and you would purchase from some other company as it was. The way that you had software written for you was that you as a customer would contact some group or organization or company that you thought had the capability of writing the software for you, and you would give them a set of specifications. You'd say, this is the data I have, and this is how I want the data to come out, and these are the steps it would take to change the data from what I have to what I would like to see. And then these people would take that group of specifications and put that into something called a program. there might be some intermediate steps. If it was a very large project, they would write a project proposal that would say to you, okay, we need to have this much more information, we're going to write this many programs, it's going to take this long, and we're going to have criteria for acceptance of this. So when they were finished, if there were so many bugs in the program you could hardly use it, well, they didn't get paid. If the documentation was unreadable, they didn't get paid. If it wasn't on time, they didn't get paid, and there were penalties, and there were points where you might check up on them and see how they're doing, and they would get a little bit of money as they went along. And this is how we did it. There wasn't any copyright law that applied to software back in those days. There wasn't any patent law that applied to software. That all came about in 1986 or so. But there was contract law, and that's the way that you protected your software and your intellectual rights. Now, because you were paying somebody to produce this software for you, after they got finished, the software belonged to you. It didn't belong to them. And if you weren't happy with the way the software was written, or if you needed to have it extended, it was your right to go out and find, either rehire the same company to extend it or whatever, if they did a good job. But if they didn't, you could hire somebody else, somebody you thought would do a better job. And that was because you owned the software, because you paid for it. Life was sweet. And back in those days, and if you listened to my talk yesterday about education and stuff, back in those days, I was a college student in 1969. And I belonged to this little organization called DECUS, where people were trying to use these wonderful things called mini computers. And these weren't, multi-million-dollar machines that would sit in the glass house. These were things that might come into the department that cost only $100,000 for something about the size of a large toaster or microwave oven. And of course you had the wonderful ASR 33 teletype that would read or write stuff at the rate of either 5 characters a second if it was really slow, or 10 characters a second if it was faster. And and that's the way you did your stuff. And the people who wrote programs for these were not people who considered themselves professional programmers. They were people who were scientists or engineers and were writing this code for their own benefit, because they needed it for their job. And when they got finished with it, they said, well, what are we going to do with this? We could try and sell it, but selling hardware is really difficult, or selling software is really difficult, right? Because when you sell software, you have to somehow sell support for it, and you have to make sure the documentation is clear, and there's different needs that people have, and they just were not in that business because they were scientists and engineers and stuff like that. So they would contribute their code to this little organization called DECUS, the Digital Equipment Corporation User Society, and IBM had one called Share, and Novell eventually had one, and a lot of the big companies had these user societies who had libraries who would take the code and redistribute it to their users for the price of putting it onto paper tape, okay? And so as a college student, I would pay for a paper catalog that had this software in it, and then I would look up the description of the software and say, hey, I think that's pretty good. And then I would pay to have the software sent to me on paper tape. And a small paper tape might cost $5, and a much longer one would cost $15. Now, $5 for a text editor was still a lot of money back in those days, and that was the equivalent of 10 pitchers of beer. As a college student, I think you could see which direction I went, okay? But because this was, in effect, free software, then when I got this paper tape, I could go to the store, get some new paper tape, put it in my ASR 33 teletype, copy the thing, and sell it to my roommates for $1 a piece. And by the time I'd made up 10 copies, I'd paid for the new paper tape, I paid for the original copy, I in effect had a free text editor, and I had my 10 pitchers of beer. So this was the way, these were the ways the software was created back in those days. Now, some problems did exist as opposed to today. I told you the fact that I couldn't afford $100,000 for a compiler back in those days as a student. Well, I couldn't afford a computer either, you know, because computers were $100,000 for the microwave oven style and a couple $1 million for the IBM mainframes, and that was when $1 million was a lot of money. It's not like today, you know. And so, you know, students couldn't really get a hold of a computer to do some, you know, hobbyist style of stuff. And communication wasn't as fast as it was today. I mean, my idea of networking was to take a box of cards and carry it down the hall when dropping them on the floor. Or later on, with early versions of Unix, this wonderful thing called UUCP, Unix to Unix copy. Man, that was great, but it was still kind of limited to 120 characters a second or so forth. And how much are you going to be emailing me? So you know, the way of collaboration that we do today was a little bit different. But there were collaborative projects. So for example, when Usenix organization, which was into Unix and making Unix go forwards, we would have meetings and people would bring their projects on magnetic tape to the Usenix meeting. We'd talk about it, and people would ship magnetic tapes back and forth through the mail and stuff. And of course, universities like Carnegie Mellon, like Berkeley, like Columbia, would have a lot of their students working on projects, and people would take sabbaticals and go to these universities to work on these things. And it was kind of great. Now, all of this started to fall apart about the period of 1977 to 1980, because what was happening was the price of computers was dropping like a rock, but the price of the software was still relatively expensive. And Sun Microsystems was a little company starting up. They developed a little single board workstation based on a Motorola chip, and you know, and it's basically a project that came out of Stanford University. But here they had a fairly powerful little computer system, but they needed a fairly powerful operating system to go on it. Now they came to Digital Equipment Corporation, they asked Ken Olsen, can we have VMS? Can we license that from you? And Ken said, no, I don't think so. I think that's a bad idea. So they went away again and they said, hey, maybe we could use this Unix thing. Well, the problem was Unix was not free.